Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Russiagate, will it ever really die? This hoax has a life of its own. Also, the foreign policy blob mobilizes around old Sleepy Joe. Cross-talking this and more, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. And in Budapest, we have George Samueli. He is author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's first go to Budapest. George, I don't know what iteration of Russiagate we're in right now, but again, we have a hoax that is evidence-free, anonymous source. The media ran with it. Of course, the political opposition in the United States, the Democrats, they ran with it, and it flopped. But I suppose most people that heard that conspiracy, the version of that conspiracy theory, believes it's true. This is turning into a pattern, I must say. George.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Peter. It is a pattern. We have the same cast of characters. We have anonymous intelligence officials. We have the Democratic Party, and we have the media. And the pattern is exactly the same, which is we have a story arise with no evidence, no documentary evidence, no one speaking on the record, and the story that flies in the face of common sense, such as, why would the Taliban want to kill Americans when Americans are withdrawing from Afghanistan? Why would the Russians want to kill Americans when the United States is doing what Russia wanted to do, which is to withdraw from Afghanistan? This common sense notions fly out of the window. And instead, we're onto the road of that stupid media story of what did the president know and when did he know it? So the media assumes something is true, and from going from, if it's true, what does this mean about relations with Putin, to saying, yes, it is true, and what's Trump going to do about it? What is he going to do with Putin? So it's exactly the same. It's the same pattern as before, and the consequences are already apparent, because we now have the House of Representatives that is tabling an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, essentially preventing any U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan unless the U.S. government can prove the negative, which is that Russians are not assassinating Americans. Well, how are you going to prove that? You can't prove a negative, but that's it. The mission accomplished. No American withdrawal.
Marcus, also to add to what George was saying here, the Taliban have been killing Americans for 18 years, okay? I mean, why would they need the Russians to help them out, okay, when that's what they've been doing? I mean, the thing that's really quite pathetic about this, in my mind, this is akin to just mutiny. I don't care how you feel about Donald Trump. This is another mutiny against the elected president of the United States by the deep state bureaucracy, and it's just being egged on by the same usual suspects, as George pointed out. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, what we have seen develop in the West over a certain period of time is a situation in which governments, lobby groups, think tanks, and movements are able to make assertions without corroborating these assertions with concrete, strong evidence. Indeed, they don't even need to back up what they are arguing with even an ounce of evidence. And that is because journalistic standards in the West have all but collapsed. Indeed, let me reword that. They have utterly collapsed. And Russia is a very good case study to exemplify that point, because ever since the American-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014, Russia has been a victim of a brutal offensive by Western mainstream media. But I think that we have to take into consideration that this November there is an American presidential election. So in the long term, this allegation that Russia has paid the Taliban to kill American and also British soldiers is, on the one hand, part and parcel of a long-term offensive against Russia to demonize it. But in the short term, there is no doubt in my mind that the emergence of this completely unfounded allegation is an attempt by the liberal elements in the American establishment to ensure, or to try and ensure, that Donald Trump is not re-elected this November. So yes, on the one hand, Russia is going to be a long-term victim of Western mainstream media, but I think this particular story is more about Trump.
Yeah, George, I mean, I don't think it really moves the needle one way or another. I mean, Russiagate, you know, the primary, the full feature film, as it were, was a complete flop. And the other iterations, Ukrainegate, it just doesn't get any traction, okay? And this is just one way, another way to take a hit at the president. But George, what's more insidious here is that on one level, it's to deny Trump fulfilling a campaign promise, ending endless wars, which I have to say, all the ones he's inherited have been enhanced. Okay, let's stay with the record, all right? But also, it's the indication that the bipartisan consensus about foreign wars is intact, and it has the support of the Democratic Party and, most importantly, of the media. Because the media will not take any moral responsibility for anything anymore. They're just the PR outfit for the DNC. But I mean, so on these two different levels here, deny Trump's fulfillment of a promise, and at the same time is to get back to the good old days of empire, the way it used to be, the way it should be. And with the last three presidential elections, the majority of people have voted against that consensus in Washington. Go ahead, George.
Yes, exactly right. There was an article the other day in the New York Times written by their diplomatic correspondent, David Sanger, who has never met a war that he didn't puff up and propagandize on behalf of. And the thrust of the article was, well, why isn't Trump fighting Russia in Libya? Why isn't he fighting it in Ukraine? Why isn't he fighting it in Syria? So the thrust of it is, this is the New York Times view, that Trump should be fighting Russia in this way. So let's add 3 more wars to the already ongoing wars that the United States is engaged in. And this is what we're getting now with this amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. This is a bipartisan effort. This is Liz Cheney, you know, we know her dad, you know, the great Cheney with the war on terror, Liz Cheney, along with the Democrats, which are absolutely determined to sabotage U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And we had this when Trump, several times floats the idea of withdrawing from Syria, howls of indignation from the Democrats, immediate accusations that he's just serving the interests of Putin. And Trump eventually is forced to withdraw. Notice what the Democrats and the media aren't indignant about. They're not indignant about the sanctions campaign against Iran. They're not indignant about an assassination of a senior Iranian leader. They're not indignant about the sanctions campaign and the theft of assets of Venezuela. So any interventions, aggression on the part of the Trump administration, the media is perfectly happy for. It's any of these tentative moves to withdraw that causes the absolute ire and fury and accusations of collaboration with Putin.
You know, Marcus, one of the origins of this a new hoax is that it was captured prisoners of the Taliban making this claim here, which of course the Afghan government would support, and the Pentagon would support, and the Empire cheerleaders would support, because it's a gravy train over there. Everybody's getting paid, and the U.S. taxpayer is paying for it. Okay, I mean the level deceit is just hard to comprehend. I mean, the amount of money that has been poured into that conflict that has not been resolved, there never should have been an invasion in the first place. To deal with Al-Qaeda, it should have been a police operation, and that's it. There was no reason to occupy that country. So, you know, all of the bad actors are teaming up, and all the people that are being demonized have no idea what they're talking about. But the media doesn't tell you that. Go ahead, Marcus.
An allegation, Peter, can only be taken seriously if it is corroborated with concrete evidence. But this allegation is to be dismissed because not only is there no strong evidence to support it, there is not an ounce of evidence to support it. And I would urge people in American mainstream media and British mainstream media to consider a fact. A few years ago, the then CIA director said publicly that America was considering ways of killing Russian soldiers in the Middle East. He was obviously referring to Russian soldiers in Syria, but I don't seem to recall articles in American media and in British media about that. And I would say to the Americans and the British, if they want a story about Afghanistan, perhaps they should consider this. Firstly, how America and Britain aided the Mujahideen, which later morphed into Al-Qaeda, in killing Soviet soldiers who had been partly deployed to Afghanistan to stem the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the region. And also, if they want another story about Afghanistan, they might like to consider running articles on how ever since the Americans and the British arrived in Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, opium production has surged upwards. Now, I believe those two stories would constitute magnificently thought-provoking articles. And there is evidence, massive evidence, to corroborate both of those.
Yeah, George, part of the program here. I mean, there's so many inconvenient truths about Afghanistan, and the most important one that Marcus pointed out to us is that it was the United States under Brzezinski that supported the Mujahideen to kill Russian Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan. No one has any sense of irony, I suppose, in Washington. Go ahead, last 30 seconds.
None at all. And it was done for no other reason other than to kill Russians. And no consideration at all for how dangerous these people were. I mean, you know, Brzezinski knew perfectly well, you know, who these people were, what fanatics they were. And yet this was great. We'll just bleed the Russians dry. You know, and they've, you know, it's a funny thing that when you get in the media who continually refer to the Soviet failure in Afghanistan. Well, they got out after 9 years. The United States has been there 19 years.
Jump in here, Jeff. We'll go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, Marcus, let me go back to you in London. I found it really quite interesting over the last few days. We have a new super PAC getting into play with the presidential election. 43 alumni for Biden, and they're all Republicans, and they're Bush-era Republicans now joining the fray in support of Joe Biden, which of course tells us is that they want to, like I said in the first part of the program, they want to go back to business as usual, empire as usual. As I pointed out, 3 election cycles in a row, the electorate voted against these wars, against interventionism, but now they want to find this new bipartisan consensus to go back the way it was. And you know, I want to point out here, Trump really has only tinkered with things. I mean, he hasn't really changed the thrust of American foreign policy around the world. And I find that to be quite disappointing, because there were a lot of people that were interested in his campaign precisely because he questioned the post-Cold War orthodoxies. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, Peter, never in my lifetime have I observed such a personalized attack on a candidate in America going into an American presidential election. It really is quite astonishing. And at the same time, it really demonstrates that the real powers that be in America are undermining American democracy. In fact, I would actually use the word they are subverting American democracy, because Donald Trump was legitimately elected in 2016. We cannot, however, say exactly the same about George Bush Jr. in 2000, because there were many, many voting irregularities regarding his victory. However, Donald Trump was legitimately elected. And yet, in the last 4 years, we have seen the liberal element predominantly, but also conservative elements do their utmost to try and bring down the Trump administration. Now, I am no friend of Trump, and I believe that whoever is in the White House is not going to make fundamental changes in America, be it domestically and also in terms of American foreign policy. But I respect the fact that he won that election. And what I absolutely loathe, Peter, is the sight of those in the American establishment who are not just secretly attempting to undermine him and bring him down. They are doing it in plain view of not just the American public, but of the entire world. That is an issue that must be addressed by the American people, that there are enemies within America who have no regard for the will of the American people. All they want to see is America in, as they would see it, the safe hands. And that is an intolerable situation.
You know, I think safe hands was one phrase, but it was the adults in the room. That was the one that was always used, George. You know, these are the adults that got us all into so much trouble in the first place. These adults, okay? And of course, I mean, if we look, I mean, it's been chronicled here. I mean, Trump every 6 months wanted to review what's going on in Afghanistan. Why aren't we out? You know, and of course, they're piling on all of these reasons, lying to him, as the deep state has historically done with presidents. I mean, Barack Obama, he just paved. Okay, he just took the knee and said, well, okay, whatever you guys want to do. Okay, you know, he abdicated his responsibility and abdicated his promise as an anti-war candidate when he was elected in the first place here. But, you know, Marcus brings up such an important point here, is because we're constantly told in broad daylight with megaphones is that we'll take care of foreign policy. It's none of your business. We're the adults in the room. We know what we're doing. Well, particularly since the end of the Cold War, they have shown that they know exactly what, they don't know what they're doing, and they go from one catastrophe after another. And I'll say it for the third time on this recording, is that the American people, through 3 different presidential cycles, said they don't want it anymore. This is a breakdown of democracy. Go ahead, George.
Yes, a complete breakdown of democracy. And that's exactly, this is the adults in the room. So let's see. We've got the Afghanistan and Iraq debacles. That's already a couple of decades that the United States is still involved there. We have the Libya debacle, a horrific civil war taking place also as a result of these adults in the room. The devastation in Syria, thanks again, adults in the room. And what are the adults now saying? Which is, we have to stay there forever and ever. When you ask these adults, well, what's the rationale? Why are you doing this? Well, then they have to start thinking, well, let's see. We got to help the Kurds. That's it. We got to help the Kurds. Yes. Why do we have to help the Kurds? I'll get back to you on that one. Or we have to prevent Assad from consolidating his regime. So let's just, you know, destroy this country just in order to prevent a legitimate government reasserting its authority, no matter how much suffering we inflict. And then it's the same with Libya. You know, well, look at all the mess that this has created, the flow of refugees into Europe and so on. We've got to maintain this, you know, our presence there. So these adults in the room are, you know, absolutely devastating. But they get this wonderful media coverage because they're pals with all the people who write these stories. But going back to this Bush crowd, these people who were part of this super PAC, I mean, they are fantasizing that they're going to come back in 4 years' time under Nikki Haley or Marco Rubio, or maybe even Jeb Bush will be resuscitated. They are delusional. It isn't going to happen. I mean, the Democrats are playing for keeps. If they do win this election with Biden this November, they are going to change the electorate. First order of business will be comprehensive immigration reform, and that's going to dramatically change the electorate. So 20, 30, 40 million, who knows how many illegals there are in the United States, will be added to the electoral roll. And then Republicans can say goodbye to Texas, to Florida, to Arizona, and there is no way Republicans are going to come back in a generation or maybe 2 generations. So it's fantasy world that somehow Republicans will be back in 2024.
Yeah, Marcus, let me read you their mission statement. It's quite interesting here. To unite and mobilize a community of historically Republican voters who are dismayed and disappointed by the damage done by our nation, done to our nation. But these are the people that have done damage to the nation. I mean, I don't, we on this program, the three of us, we've often kind of dissected Trump's foreign policy, and that's for people that are really into it like ourselves here. But I mean, stepping back quite broadly, Trump has had very little impact on the thrust of American foreign policy. He's been able to do some things on the margin and not actually very well. I mean, I find it really quite astounding is that even tinkering on the margins is considered, you have to be driven out of the church because you somehow have short-circuited the purpose and drive and the economics and business model behind empire. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, Peter, that statement you just read to me ranges between regurgitated bile and tedious drivel. It really is absolutely laughable. But what it demonstrates is something I said earlier on in this program, that people are able to make the most outrageous of statements, the most ridiculous of statements, the most preposterous of statements. And yet they know that because media standards have collapsed, have eroded in, for example, America, there is going to be no scrutiny of what they are saying. They know that journalists are not going to stand up in a press conference and ask them penetrating questions. So that really is a very, very serious state of affairs, which has developed not just in America, Peter, but equally too in Britain. And it also reinforces that it doesn't really matter who's in the White House. And indeed, the Bidens of this world are just front people. What we have in America and what we have in Britain is a permanent, unseen government, and they are the ones who determine the fundamentals in America and in Britain, and when it comes to American foreign policy and British foreign policy. And this absolutely fanciful statement of adults in the room. Well, let's examine this statement. Let's have a look at Bill Clinton, because he's obviously one of the adults in the room. This is the man who said he sat in the Oval Office and prayed to God. He asked God, "Dear God, shall I attack Serbia?" And Peter, guess what God told him? "Yes, dear Bill, attack Serbia." And then we have George Bush Jr., who, let's be absolutely frank, and in no way am I being condescending, the man was and remains semi-literate. And yet these apparently are the adults in the room. Well, it just demonstrates, Peter, why the world is in such a perilous condition today when you have such men in the White House.
Right, well, and it's worse than that, George, because let's just imagine a Biden presidency. I mean, I'm sure Biden will be treated with kid gloves like he is now as a candidate, the way Barack Obama was, okay? Never ask him a hard question, or never challenge authority, all right? I mean, I have no problem with people challenging Donald Trump's authority. I just wish they would do it in a fact-based world, okay, instead of their fantasy world that they live in. And it's only getting worse. And I think one of the lasting damage that we will see through all of this is that the media has just discredited itself so much. is that, and I think that's one of the reasons, particularly in the United States, why there is so much anger and rage, because nobody knows what to believe anymore. It's just one big propaganda show from beginning to end. And I think most people, they look at their everyday lives and they're trying to understand why are these things happening to me? Because, you know, they see these people, social distancing, get away, stay at home, and then, protests will go right out. I mean, that is so glaring for people, is that, what is it? Which one is it? And are you telling the truth? And you're probably not telling the truth because you have your own agenda and it has nothing to do with the people. Go ahead, George, finish up.
Yes, that's it. The media have an agenda. And what media are supposed to be doing, which is to create an informed public, to provide the public with information about what government is doing and what governance is about. Instead, they have become propagandists for one side of the debate. And so whatever is the Democratic Party talking point of the day, the media are spreading it. And so suddenly, what is the media story like? What's Trump going to do about Putin? Why isn't Trump facing up to Putin? And, what is the story that doesn't...
We're running out of time, but I hope our viewers think that they're getting a semblance of truth and logic on this program. That's all the time we have. Many thanks to my guests in London and Budapest, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, crosstalk rules.